Okay, so we start our section on non-consequentialist theories, chapter 6 in our text, with a discussion of Kant. And for Kant, there is such a thing as moral knowledge. So we can be said to know, for example, that we ought to tell the truth. But such knowledge is not the knowledge of what is, or of how people actually behave. It's more a knowledge of how people ought to behave. And this knowledge is a priori. As you find in the excerpt, it's probably a phrase you're not familiar with. A priori simply means that the knowledge does not depend on people's actual behaviors or our experiences. It's a knowledge that we can come to know simply through reason. As an example, even if everybody went around telling lies, the fact that we ought not to tell lies would still be true, morally true for Kant. Just because nobody practices it does not mean that it's not true. Therefore, we can't tie the moral knowledge to what we witness in people's behaviors. So the statement is true independently of people's conduct, and in this sense, it is truly a priori. Necessity and universality are characteristics of a priority. So if we say men ought to tell the truth, our knowledge that there are men depends on experience, obviously, but there must be at least an a priori element in the judgment. And for Kant, the primary task of the moral philosopher should be of isolating the a priori elements in our moral knowledge and showing their origin. Now, Kant doesn't mean to imply, even though he can be read this way, has been mistakenly read this way, that we are all explicitly aware of the a priori knowledge. So just that because we can come to it through reason, because we don't need experience, does not mean that we automatically know. If we automatically knew what was morally right, then we wouldn't need moral theory. We could walk around being very holy beings. But as it is, our moral knowledge, taken as a whole, has a variety of elements. And it's the task of the moral philosopher to figure out this a priori element and to free it from all of the empirically derived elements, all of the elements that are based on our experience, and to show that it has origin in practical reason. And practical reason is another Kantian term. So what is practical reason? It is reason in its practical or moral use. As Kant said, ultimately, and we quote, there is only one and the same reason which has to be distinguished simply in its application. End quote. So though ultimately one, reason can be concerned, we're told, with its object, that which it is reasoned about, in two different ways. It can determine the object as an object being given through some other source than reason itself, or it can make the object real through reason. The first way of coming to know an object is theoretical reason, and the second is practical reason. In its theoretical function, reason determines the object given in intuition, which is yet another Kantian term that I won't go into here. It applies itself, this theoretical reason, as it were, to a datum, some sensory inputs given from another source than reason itself. In its practical function, however, reason is the source of its objects. Practical reason is concerned with moral choice, not with applying categories of data to sensory input or sensory intuition. So, for Kant, the moral philosopher is to find in practical reason the source of the a priori element in moral knowledge or moral judgment. But we can't say that Kant expects the philosopher to derive all of moral law, its form and its content, from the concept of practical reason. The philosopher is concerned with finding the source in practical reason of the a priori element in the moral judgment, as we've said. And this statement implies that there is an a posteriori element, which is given empirically. This is what we get through our senses, through our experiences. Now this seems obvious in the case of a singular moral judgment, such as the judgment that I am morally obliged to respond to someone who approaches me or sends me an email. But I can distinguish between the concept of moral obligation as such and the empirically given conditions of this particular duty, of responding to this particular letter, inquiry, or email, and responding to a particular person. So when Kant speaks of practical reason or rational will as kind of the source of moral law, he's really thinking of practical reason as such, practical reason in itself, not necessarily the practical reason found in a specific class of being, humans. He's concerned with the moral imperative as bearing on all beings which are capable of being subject to obligation, whether they are men, women, or not. Hence he is concerned with the moral imperative regarded as antecedent to the consideration of human nature and its empirical conditions. And if practical reason is viewed from this very abstract way, it would follow then that the moral laws, insofar as they make sense only on the supposition that they are human beings, cannot be deduced from the concept of practical reason. For instance, it would be absurd to think of the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," applying to pure spirits, for it presupposes bodies and the institution of marriage. But we have to distinguish between the pure ethics, or the metaphysics of morals, which deal with the supreme principle of morality, and with the nature of moral obligation and applied ethics, which applies the supreme principle to the conditions of human existence. Now Kant's morals are wrapped very much in his physics, his metaphysics, and his epistemology, so we won't kind of delve into it from there, but you'll notice from the way that he writes, he has a very specific terminology that you really need to be accustomed to in order to fully understand him. So his main point, as we say all this, Kant wishes to make, is that the basis of obligations, quote, "the basis of obligation must not be sought in human nature or in the circumstances of the world in which man is placed, but a priori simply in the concepts of pure reason." So what is he saying? That we must work out a pure ethics which, and we'll quote again, "when applied to man does not borrow the least thing from the knowledge of man himself, but gives laws a priori to him as a rational being." So we are concerned with finding in reason itself the basis of the a priori element in the moral judgment. We are not concerned with deducing all the moral laws by mere analysis from the concept of pure practical reason. In fact, Kant didn't think that this could even be done. So, where does that leave us with Kant? Specifically, we're going to talk about here the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. So, as we go forward here, so in the groundwork, we're told that the metaphysics of morals is concerned to investigate, and I quote again, "the source of the practical principles which are to be found a priori in our reason." And I know it sounds like I keep saying this over and over, but it's really key that you understand this point. The groundwork itself is, and I quote, "nothing more than the investigation and establishment of the supreme principle of morality, and thus to constitute a complete treatise in itself." At the same time, the groundwork is not a complete critique of practical reason, because there is actually a second critique. Now the first part of the groundwork deals with the transition from common or ordinary knowledge to philosophical moral knowledge. The second part with a transition from popular moral philosophy to the metaphysics of morals, and the third with the final step from the metaphysics of morals to the critique of pure practical reason. And then that leads us into the critique that I just mentioned. So just to give you a little bit of a context of where he's coming from, this is a very complicated system.